This is the first lecture for the Theories of Law and Human Rights class. It's Political Science 286. General rule, if something goes on the board, a term, you need to know that. So make sure you write that down. Also, if we should cover a concept that's in one of the readings, I will try and give you the page number so that you know where to find it. Some of the readings are kind of dense, are really meant for graduate students or law students, because we're dealing with theories of law and human rights. The approach is not just to talk about some of the theories. You can get very much into the weeds on that. This is an undergraduate class, and so the goal is not necessarily to give you a sweeping and thorough review of the various theories, but give you some sort of practical background for understanding how you should view human rights and the role of law in that. So we start with some basic concepts, ideas that are important for you to get under your belt, so we can build on them. But the other thing that you have to kind of also keep in mind is that we care about integrating those ideas. Okay, and I will stay either in the venue of law or human rights and bring those together as best I can. I will try and keep the examples reasonable and approachable so that you can get a clearer view of the ideas that we are sort of exploring. Okay, so the fundamental idea here is that there's a relationship, right, between law and human rights. If there weren't, there'd be a different title to the class, right? Okay, so there's a connection. And what I'm going to say up front is that law has a fundamental purpose in advocating and advancing human rights. So we have a couple of problems. First and foremost, how we define human rights. That's a big one. And it's very involved. And again, we'll try and keep it a place where we can sort of work our way through that. And law. There again, we have to find a part of the law that is more universal and then talk about applicability and so on. So there's a lot of getting our mind around how this all gets structured. So let's start. Where do human rights come from? What is fundamentally what we're talking about? So let's just keep this straight away. Fundamental human right. What might those be? Because the law has to address those, and our definition of human rights, no matter how involved it becomes, has to embody these ideas. So fundamentally, human rights, and we'll talk about natural law and all of that later, but human rights has got to be rational. Okay, now we'll talk about reasonableness later, but has to be rational. That's to say, we have to come to terms with what is and what is not to be encompassed in the concept. So let's just keep it sort of straight away. So we're expecting that in a society, because that's what we're concerned with, not concerned with other structures. It's a society, whether it's international and there's a governing body like the United Nations, or whether it's the United States, and the governing body there is, as you'll see, the rule of law. So if there's no rational way to approach this, then we can't go any further. There's got to be a rational way of looking at this. And fundamentally, we're concerned with when people come together. We're not concerned with someone that lives on their own, somewhere out, in the woods. There's no interaction between people. No one can affect their human rights. No one can take them away. No one can advance them. But human beings are social animals. And so when we come together and we begin to meet, even if it's just two people, the first thing that those two would do is be suspicious of each other and concerned about various things. They're not going to call it human rights, but and then they would have some sort of social interaction, maybe over things like division of labor and so on and so forth. Remember that in our model right now, there's no economic considerations. You can't avoid those. A lot of human rights depend upon economic structure. And we'll get into that a bit. Again, it's not an economics class, and there may be a graph or two, but I promise it won't be anything that you need to have years of economics under your belt. All right, So why would someone choose to become a member of a society? So you get one or two or three or four people meeting in that open field. Why do you join that? Why do you join that group and not just go out on your own? Well, the key here is fundamentally at its base, survival. If you think there's a better chance of surviving as a member of the group than not, you're going to join the group. That's rational. Why? Because survival is a fundamental right. And what I mean by that is everyone has the right to do those things which advance their ability to survive. If you can't do that, there's really no point to any of this, right? So survival will start there. So we got to figure out what that means. Well, every living thing on the planet, I don't care if it's ants all the way up to human beings, it's reasonably assumed to be the case that that wherever life form exists, its job first and foremost is always to try and survive. Even if you think of the idea of evolution, right? Those that are capable of surviving under change will perpetuate themselves, right? Huntington's book on political order and changing societies, for example, really addresses this issue. The one constant is change, right? Nothing's going to remain the same. And so you need some system of justice and some understanding of human rights that embody those changes. When we talk about human rights, are we talking about those things which by nature can change? Or are they so fundamental they could never change? I would make the argument that they're so fundamental that the concept doesn't change, but the way in which we view that concept or we enforce that concept may very well change, but it doesn't change the fundamental nature of the concept. So for example, write what law you will, but you can't write a law that says certain people will not survive, right? We don't have to look very far in our history back to understand this, right? And see what the outcome is, right? Genocide of many different groups, enslavement of different groups. So for human beings, anything that is reasonably attached to survival is a defensible human right. I have the right to eat. If you write a law that says I can't eat, I have a right to survive. There's no point in writing law in a society that says some group does not have a right to survive. We're not going into religion. That's a very different undertaking. All right. So what we have to then ask ourselves is there some sort of guiding principle that can be applied, right, to the resolution of inevitable conflict that arises between those seeking their own legitimate ends? What we mean by that is that what governs how we deal with change, but don't eradicate a fundamental right? How do we deal with that? All right. So you've got legitimate rights, but how do we deal with circumstances that may affect that right? So, for example, we have a situation where there's great civil unrest. Does the government have a right then to say to those folks, you're not to come out of your houses? We're trying to put down the civil unrest or control it because that threatens people's survival and also threatens the rule of law. And so you can't come out of your homes. Is that acceptable? Well, yes, on some level. There's a greater good there, and we'll get into all of that. So rights, even human rights, can have some play. There are times when even the right to eat, for example, has to be limited in certain ways. So, for example, you can't fish in this particular river or stream or lake because it's polluted, and consuming any of that food would do greater harm than it would good, right? And so there is a rationale for limiting things to actually protect the population at large. All right, so keep in mind that we've already decided to join a society, a governing body and that sort of thing. And there are going to be differences, right, between nations and the like. But we've decided to join um, I guess decide is not necessarily correct. You could be born into a society or a structure. Obviously, most people are. And with that come an acceptance of the rules and the like. What's key here is you don't really, no one gives you a list and says, you've just been born, now you know how to read, so here's the contract. We sort of are born into it, and the culture and so on reinforces it, and we just become sort of accustomed to it. So how do we go about that? Suppose let's take two individuals in a society, individual A, individual B, and both have a legal right to do X. X could be speak freely and the like. All right, so let's talk about a way of approaching that conflict. Again, there's going to be change, there's going to be a conflict. Well, there are two weights and measures, as I call them, that must be applied. The first is one's rights must end where another individual's rights begin. If you look at freedom of speech, in America, that's a fundamental right. If you look at freedom of speech, it's limited. In the exercising of your right, you can't diminish or eliminate the right of another. Normally, there are exceptions. There are always exceptions. So that's the first thing. The second is when there's a conflict in those rights, then you have to evaluate and weigh each right and a reasonable exercise of that right. Is someone exercising their right reasonably? The example, yelling fire in a crowded theater. It's pretty clear that exercising your right to freedom of expression becomes problematic because it puts other people in jeopardy as they run for the doors and trample each other and the like. So there are limitations. So let's talk about a ridiculous example here that I think makes it clear. This is not a real case, obviously, but it does illustrate the fundamental issues and why it's weights and measures, and you'll see reasonableness and all of that we consider. All right, so for over 50 years, the Hicklebottoms have had their annual family gathering the weekend before Labor Day at the home of the oldest surviving family member. Okay, that's presently, Edwina Hicklebottom is the eldest surviving family member and has hosted the family gathering for the last 10 years. Okay. Her neighbor, R.U. Sirius, is a quiet, bookish 85-year-old woman. R.U. Has lived in the same house since she was 2. Hicklebottoms can get rather raucous, celebrating themselves each of the last 10 years. R.U. has sequestered herself in her house, window shut, music on, and a great book in her hand. So she's a neighbor, living next door. This year was such a beautiful day that she, R.U., wanted to sit in her garden, surrounded by her favorite flowers, and read under a stunning blue sky. However, the Hicklebottoms made it impossible for her to enjoy her book and flowers. She couldn't take it any longer, because they were so loud, and called the police, who she wanted to tell the Hicklebottoms to quiet down. Now the Hicklebottoms have a right to gather, and R.U. has a right to read in her garden. So these two rights are reasonable and they're legitimate. Okay? So applying these two, weights and measures ideas. First, we have to extract the pertinent facts for our analysis. In law, I don't give you, especially in law school, you're going to have to read through the facts, and make a determination about which facts one should apply and which facts you don't. For example, the fact that it's a beautiful day has no real bearing on the right. There's nothing that says anywhere that if it's a beautiful day, you must allow people to read books outdoors. So that's not pertinent, right? So one of the things you do is look at all the facts and ferret through those facts and move out of the way those facts which are really not of any value. In terms of deciding, how we look at a particular fundamental right. So is the right of a family to gather and the right to read peacefully in one's garden, is that a conflict? Without a conflict, there's nothing that needs to be resolved, right? It's akin to that person going off and living in the woods and having no neighbors and the like. Okay, so suppose, let's make a couple of changes here. Suppose the sound was one that both parties found pleasing. The Hicklebottoms are making this noise or sounds, and RU finds it really pleasing. There's been no impact other than a good one, and you can't. It makes no sense to make a judgment determining, what the outcome should be in a conflict if there's no cost to anyone, right? No cost really means there's no issue, right? So she gets a benefit. She can't really claim, or you can't really claim that the noise they're making somehow should stop, right? So a benefit from some action that someone else, reasonably does, eliminates really any conflict. Makes sense, right? You can't have conflict when there's no negative impact. All right. So what about if the noise level could not travel? Let's say noise was of the nature where it couldn't travel more than 10 feet. And so she couldn't hear it. Again, there's no conflict because there's no harm done. She can't hear it. She can't claim that I know they're doing it and I want to stop. So assuming that both of those conditions exist, right, that there is going to be a right involved where there's a conflict between legitimate rights of two individuals or two groups, and that there must be some sort of harm, right? Okay, so now the question is, exercising that right, how much harm does that cause? So the Hicklebottoms making a bunch of noise might be annoying, but it's not necessarily rise to the level, perhaps, so we have to figure out, of either eradicating or limiting the right of the Hicklebottoms to have some fun at their family gathering. So you have to look at each event. So it's not just the right, it's what the impact of that right is in the exercising of it. Go back to the idea of yelling fire in a crowd theater. It makes no sense to allow someone to exercise that right in that way, because what it does is it causes greater harm than good. So by my exercising my right, if it does greater harm than good, then my exercising of it actually has less of a value than the negative impact. We would want to look at that. And courts, in this case, would have to make a decision about that. They both have a right. So how do you decide what right takes precedent here? You have to look at the outcome of the exercise of that right, and whether or not that right is being exercised in a way consistent with what how that right was structured. So if you're looking at the United States, for example, it's the U.S. Constitution that really structures those rights in the Bill of Rights, 14th Amendment, and others. What's interesting about this is when you come together as a society, you have to think about the rights we have vis-a-vis each other and the rights we have vis-a-vis the governing body. Okay? So if you look at the Bill of Rights, the first right, when you talk about liberty and the like, we have to think about what you're allowed to do. And freedom of speech is one of those things, right to assemble, worship, and all that. That's really important. But also, we need to protect ourselves from the government. And outside the Second Amendment, which we don't want to get into because it's contentious, and it doesn't really help us advance our understanding, because the right to bear arms, you have three schools: those that don't care about the issue at all, those that think it's unqualified, those that think it can be qualified, and the like. But think about it in terms of fundamental human rights in the Constitution. What we have here is the right to bear arms, freedom from housing troops, and so on and so forth. But freedom of speech and expression is what's really key. And not the others are diminished in value, but it's key to look at that. But if you look at the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, there are other things in there. And it would make sense because you're not talking about just one societal structure. You're talking about how when other societies come together, other governments, how they interact, because governments are very different than people. How governments are constrained in an international environment or aided will have an impact on them vis-a-vis other nations. So the nation becomes sort of the major player. But nevertheless, however that nation is treated is a function of the structures they put in place, and they do have an impact. They do have an impact. So let's just look at, and this is in your book, there's in the readings, the first reading, comparing the United States Bill of Rights and the United States. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights is there's a right to remedy, a right to be innocent until proven guilty. Now, that's really important. How do you prove you're not guilty? How do you prove you didn't do something? The burden should be on that person. In this case, it would be our friend RU to say that there's been some infraction and to prove it. The plaintiff needs to prove that the defendant did something. You cannot protect yourself from the government and the structure if you have to prove your innocence or the fact that you're not guilty of doing something. You can prove you didn't do something. Where's your evidence going to come from? And is the burden really on you? People could go ahead and charge you with all kinds of things, and if you have to prove you didn't do it, it becomes a lot more complicated. So the right to remedy, the right to be innocent until proven guilty, right to be free, to have free movement. This is all the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. A right to asylum. Now that does not impact within a nation of its citizens. This idea of asylum necessarily. We're not getting into religion. Okay, the right to have a nationality, the right to family, the right to social security, the right to desirable work and trade unions, the right to rest, right to be adequate living standard, health, housing, food, etc., the right to education, the right to participate in culture. What's interesting is that this moves into how each nation structures itself, right? And what's most sort of challenging about this, as are all things of the United Nations, you're leaving it up to the member states to sort of enforce this. But functionally, they all agree that these things are important. So let's look at the Constitution and compare it to the United Nations and see if whether there's commonality. Okay? Both talk about freedom of religion. Again, we're not going to touch on that because that's a very complicated subject that would take us far afield. Freedom of speech and press. Why is that important? A free exchange of ideas. You can't alter when there are changes how your structure, your government is put together if in fact you don't have the right to express those ideas. The press's primary function, it really are two. I'm sorry, there are two functions. One is to close the gap in terms of information between the government and citizens. The media points things out, questions leadership, and that presumably that will alter policy and the like. So it's very important. Freedom of assembly and association. Again, free exchange of ideas, and we're social beings. Without the right to be social, to assemble peacefully, it affects our ability not only to understand more, but also comfort in some way, to know that others share the same experience that we have. So allowing groups to come together, again, they can come together in ways that will eliminate the rights of others and the like. Freedom from unlawful search and seizure. Sounding a lot like the U.S. Constitution, right? Well, search and seizure, if they can come into your home at any point and look through whatever you have, there's no right to be left alone. Oddly enough, one of the fundamental principles of a government is leaving people alone. It's there to advocate for and resolve issues, not going into people's lives and looking for things that they can use against that person without the controlling body, the court, saying you have a right to go in and do this. And you got to prove to the court that there's a rational reason for you to do this, a reasonable expectation. You're going to find what you're looking for, and that what you're looking for is essential to some sort of violation of the law. The right to due process. The rule of law here is what we're talking about. Everybody gets treated the same. In a society, that's fundamental, right? That we have a right to be left alone, and we have a right to be treated the same way as everyone else when we confront the government, that there's due process. Freedom from unlawful speech and search, freedom from arbitrary arrest. You can't take away someone's right to move about or freedom willy-nilly. Again, you have to demonstrate that there's some greater good in doing this. And if you can't do that, then it's not permitted. The right to a fair trial. This is, I think, for some people, a little bit difficult to get their minds around completely. A fair trial doesn't necessarily always produce the most just outcome. Remember that we're fallible as human beings, and so there are people that, although innocent, still go to prison and the like. Remember that in the United States, there's a couple of standards here, right? If we look, preponderance of the evidence is one thing, right? This, we can't really prove it, but boy, there's a lot of indications that this occurred. And we talk about, capital offenses, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. There's always going to be some sort of doubt, right? But you can't go beyond reason. You've got to be able to accept that there could be an imperfection in the system. Freedom from cruel and unusual punishment. It's interesting. What does cruel and unusual really mean? For the Supreme Court dealing with capital offenses and where people are put, are executed, the court has basically said, well, this is not, unusual. It's been going on for a long time. And it's not necessarily cruel if you do it in a certain manner. Going back, there was the way it had been done, we thought was humane, would be you would take the person and you would inject one drug into them, which relaxed them and eliminated pain, because it's cruel to make them aware of the fact that this is happening to them and put them in pain. Taking their life doesn't necessarily require you to be cruel. And then the next thing is that lethal injection that ends their life. Well, it turns out that the drug we were using to sort of relax them and that sort of thing and limit their ability to feel pain wasn't doing its job. What it did was it immobilized people so they could not move or express they were experiencing pain. So there they were in pain, not being able to speak out, not being able to show they were in pain, and then the lethal injection was administered. And the court said, wait a minute, you can't use this drug, it's cruel. Why? There's an alternative way to do this that ends in the same way, but doesn't have a process where the person is unduly punished or in pain. Okay? Freedom from slavery, the right to be equal. In a society, if you're under the thumb of the government or another group, you're not really free. And you would not choose to join that society because who wants to live under those conditions? They could turn around and point the finger at you or your group and say, we're going to do X, Y, or Z with you. Protection from discrimination. Now, discrimination is complicated. When we say discrimination, we tend to think that that's based on race. It could be based on class, it could be based on any number of things, gender. So when we say free of discrimination, we have to understand there are many things and ways in which we can discriminate in terms of people or a group. And part of the problem there, or the challenge I should say, is the right to sort of address that thing. And lastly, the right to vote. The right to vote is the way in which you have a peaceful revolution, if you will. That is so important to saying the way in which the government has dealt with changes is unacceptable, and so we want to vote to change the government. Now, you also have to respect the outcome. So without respecting the outcome, why have the vote? If one group is going to say, no, well, we don't like that, as other countries do, usually countries that are controlled by a dictator. We don't like the outcome, so we're not going to do that, right? I mean, that's fundamentally problematic. Here's the thing: how different nations address those questions and how those nations actually, implement them is going to be different. And the question becomes, how do we monitor that, and how different do they have to be before we say this is not an acceptable way? And then, in the case of the United Nations, how do you enforce that? You can't have one nation coming in and controlling another nation. There is an exception, of course, when there's war. So the idea here is there a way to address the issue and figure out what a fundamental right might be? Well, yes, there is. In an economic theory of justice, so we want to remember that, an economic theory of justice, what I refer to as a brain in a jar. In that structure, written by Rawls, the idea is, what kind of structure would people want if, they didn't know who they were? What's referred to as a veil of ignorance. Don't know who you are, and you're going to figure out what kind of governmental structure you want, and then once you figure it out, the veil is lifted and you see who you are. You see your race, you see your gender, you see your age, you see your physical, countenance, you see all of that. And then the rules that you set up then get applied to everybody, across the board. And so you want to change the rule if the rule is discriminatory, let's say, against, one of the genders. Or today, there's the complication of having more than just two, right? What would happen? So it's gotten more complicated in some ways. Other ways, it's straightforward, right? So I refer to it as a brain in a jar. If you pull a brain out and you put it in a jar, no one knows what body or where they're going to be put in the social order or economic order. What would happen? What kind of society would they want? And it's reasonable to assume that what they're going to want is one that embodies these principles, these human rights. They would want to protect themselves and survive and perpetuate themselves under a system that would not discriminate against them based on physical structures, based on intellectual. I mean, do we want to discriminate against people that don't have a high enough IQ? Do you want to discriminate against those people that don't have athletic ability? What is the standard? And what we find is we come to these very principles we find in the UN, United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, and we find them in the Constitution of the United States, in the Bill of Rights. I'm not going to talk about the articles, Article 1, 2, and 3, that deal with the structure of the legislature, the executive, and the courts in that order. Because the way it's structured is to limit power. Grant power, some of it defined, some of it not. If you look at Article 1, Section 8, there's a litany of authority that the Congress and the Senate have. It gets a little more vague with general terminology in the executive branch. And then, in the courts, especially the Supreme Court, there's not a whole lot of structure put there. That was going to be developed when they first, their first Congress. And these things would be somehow, codified and agreed to by the states and so on. So when we look at the Bill of Rights, we're looking at something that recognizes, or a document that recognizes, human nature, which is greedy and fearful by nature. I mean, put that in perspective, if you will. Here we are on a planet, hurling through space, rotating, moving through an unknown, darkness. Don't know who we are, how we got here, not in a scientific way, and where we're going. And unlike other animals, we know it. we are cognizant of it. We have enough of brain capacity that we know these things to be true. Again, I'm keeping religion out of it. It's not. I don't want to engage the idea that, well, religion gives you that answer. That's far afield. Very interesting topic, but not what we want to really approach and sort of explore here. Although it is explored under moral principles, human rights, and that sort of thing. So when you think about our awareness of those things, and you want to survive, you have to survive in an environment where basically you know you have no control, and that there's no guarantee that you won't have a horrible life and suffer tremendously. So it's natural for us to be fearful. It's natural for us to decide that we need more resources. I'm talking about the economic element of this, which we'll get into later on. Even though we may have a lot of resources, I'm sure that Bezos, richest man in the world, still has moments where he thinks, I need more. That's an ongoing argument about one person, having more than another, more than they need. Well, how do you define need? And what about the economic structure? Capitalism, I would argue, and democracy don't go together well. There are conflicts between them. We've got to come up with a better system, perhaps, but right now it's the best we've been able to do in terms of human rights and so on and so forth. And so when we look at that, people will say, well, why should one person have so much when there are people that have so little? Well, the average American has a lot more than, say, some very poor nation, people suffering under, maybe a despotic rule and the like. So how do you really measure all of that? There's no doubt that, someone that makes, or is worth even $5 million, I'm saying even like that's a small amount of money. Think about it, the average wage of the American citizen, let's just say it's $50,000, which it's not, but I want to work with easy numbers here. That means it takes 2 years to make $100,000. If you want to make $5 million, how long does that take you? You're talking about a very long period of time. If it takes you 1 year to make $50,000, to make $5 million, and I'm just saying to make it right, takes a lot longer, right? Do the math. So someone works their entire work life and may not ever reach that number. And if you think about putting in 40 or 50 hours a week, they give over a lot of their life, a lot of their time, which is basically all we have to exchange, right? Is our time, our labor. Is that fair? I always think of how much money would have to be on the floor, just drop there, for it to make sense for Bezos or Gates or one of the elites to actually bend over and pick it up. Would they see a $20 bill and do that? Most people would pick it up. Not necessarily look for the owner. There's greed again, right? Well, it's not worth their time. If someone can make $13 million in a day, when you look at that per minute or even per second, it doesn't make sense to waste your time picking it up. Now, the average person, as I said, would. So there's this great disparity. And economics is the opposite side of the coin to politics or policy. You can't ignore one or the other. They go hand in hand. They move each other. And as a consequence, you can't ignore them, right? You can't say, well, I don't care about the economics of it. No, you need to care about the economics of it. And the policy in a democracy is, that is created by the governing bodies, doesn't necessarily advocate in a way that is economically acceptable to people, but the economics of it and the way we set it up is perfectly okay. Example, at what point do you stop someone from earning money? How much is enough? And does that violate a fundamental right that they have to advocate for themselves and to work and so on? It's a question that, again, we could stay on forever. It's not going to necessarily be easy to answer. All right, so these ideas that we're talking about here, the structure of things is such that we're going to come down to this idea of practical reasonableness, okay, which we haven't touched on yet. Practical reasonableness. And we'll define that next time. But the idea embodies two things: those things which are practical and those things which are reasonable, able to be reasoned by the average person. And so the concept is an interesting one because practical embodies a whole bunch of different ideas, and reasonableness assumes that people can work their way through to what is reasonable and what makes sense. Okay, there's a few things that I think are important to sort of garner from this first lecture. First, our approach, especially the things we're not going to touch on. And there's no way to talk about law and human rights without going into all of these various components. You just can't do it, not in a thorough way. No one, looks to do things or can do things in such a thorough way. One of the major problems I think students have is accepting that you can't come up, or it's very difficult to come up with ideas and apply them that are broad in application. In other words, most students think, well, if I cover all the concepts, I write an essay on all the concepts we're going to go over in theories of law and human rights, that's what you need to do in order to have it be valuable. No, it's thinking small. It's taking one piece of it and saying, I'm going to work on this one piece, and then that one piece is sort of distributed out. It's criticized, it's analyzed by others. So there's no, it's not like science where you find something, here's how it works, and everyone agrees on it. The bottom line here is that you can't do that. So the idea of terminology and the like is not just to give you a whole bunch of terms, but to tell you where to focus your attention. Those things that I've limited, which is the second thing, and so we're not going to talk about that, it's only because it's so broad, it's a subject unto itself, and if we don't rein in what we're looking at and focus on that, we're going to be focusing on everything, and you can't do that because it's impossible. So we look at a narrow sort of spectrum. Now, can we be criticized by others that say you don't need moral rights and all of this? Sure. But my argument back is, where do we stop? If we keep expanding out a theory of everything, then we really explain nothing. So there's a rationale here for limiting things. All right. The third thing is that just don't memorize, what terms mean. You have to integrate the ideas. There is an impact or an association between practical reasonableness and economic theory of justice. And once you know what those terms mean, you understand them, it's always good to try and bring those things together. Now, it seems contrary to what I just said about not going too broad. Bring them together in a way that focuses in the direction we're moving. Do not expand them out. That's great in terms of having a conversation, but academically, and it becomes very difficult to control that. And after a while, you're all over the place, and no one really knows exactly what you're talking about. Finally, you have to understand that even the ideas we explore are not going to be thorough. We go deep enough in so that we can move on to other concepts and integrate. Part of what I have to do is make a decision about where we stop. You can't argue with that. It's unfortunate, but that's the way it's structured, right? I have to decide what we're going to look at. Look, if you go to law school and you're taking, constitutional law, let's say, the professor has to decide. I have so much time. How much time am I going to give to each topic? Which topic is most important, and how much time am I going to give to it? You have to make that decision. Another professor might decide something else. For example, one of the important cases, some of the cases in constitutional law, is Marbury versus Madison. Has to deal with judicial review. Now, some professors in law school will just not address the case at all. It's been talked about to death. We're going to ignore that. Others feel you must cover it. So I'm making decisions. They're not all going to be satisfying to you, and they're not all going to necessarily be the best choice in terms of what others want to know. But it's the way in which I feel we have to move. So this ends the first lecture, and you should read the first two articles. The first on comparing the United States Bill of Rights is really just a page with the chart. The next reading is longer, and it's more dense. So next time we're going to talk about what you need to pull out of that. Page numbers, what's there. I'll explain the concepts. They'll go on the board. But I would like you should, I sent them to you, so you should try and make your way through them. As you're reading it, pay attention, but don't get lost in the tall grass. Just try to get what you can out of it, so when I lecture on it, you have some idea of what's important and we explore it. If you just wait for the lecture, you may miss things contextually that might be problematic for you. So it's always best to do the reading before I lecture on it. It'll be the next article. That's the next lecture. And so you should approach getting that done. It will be helpful. It will be really helpful because we can clarify the concepts. Okay, last thing. You can listen to these lectures at any point. You can listen to them more than once, although experience tells me that that's probably not going to happen. I will try and keep the lectures to around 45 minutes. Some can be done, in 30 minutes. Some might take longer than 45 minutes, but I'm going to try and keep them to 45 minutes. I would not binge watch the lectures because it's going to be too much. Try and keep up with that. All the material that we will talk about in the first part is going to be on the midterm. Could be on the midterm. So it's helpful to do that. Take your notes, follow along. If I write something on the board or I give you a page number and I read something, write that down. That's important. I design the midterm. I design the final. It's going to be covering things that I think are important, not minutia. I'm not looking to get anyone here. That's not the point. The point is to learn. So I'm not looking to say, they'll never get this. This is going to be wrong. They're going to get this one wrong. My experience tells me that if you're just fair, you'll have a reasonable distribution, a bell curve, on every question. So here's what happens. It's a multiple choice. I look at every question and I see how students answered it. If I don't see a bell curve where most people, right, have get it, right? If I see that there are too many people that have nailed the answer, maybe that question wasn't tough enough. If I see a lot of people that didn't get the right answer, I think maybe that question was too tough in terms of how I wrote it. I try and write it in a way, obviously, that doesn't give away the answer, but is not so dense you can't figure out where you're going. If I see there's a deviation in the bell curve, I recognize that the question was too easy or too difficult. I tend to leave the easy ones alone. I tend to curve on the ones that were most difficult. There's usually very few of those. There may be a couple of questions, and sometimes I'll look at those 2 or 3 questions and think they should have gotten that one. But this one, I could see it was poorly worded or there's a problem with it. I'm not looking to hurt anybody in terms of their grade, but I want to be fair, and I want to make sure you're getting something out of the class. So that's how we proceed. So lectures come up on Monday or Tuesday. They're tied to the reading. So for the next several weeks, it'll be about one reading assignment per lecture. I will put more than one together with another if I think it makes sense and the material is not so dense that students can get their mind around it. So that's how we structure it. Okay, that ends the first lecture, and try and get this one done by the time next Monday or Tuesday comes.